A billionaire paid a single dad for his cleanup work with a worthless wine cellar. Then experts valued it at $1,000,000. The room everyone believed was worthless was eventually valued at more than the mansion standing above it. But the $30 million estimate is not what I remember most. What I remember is the look in Victoria Ashford's eyes when she entered that cellar for the first time after her father died. She stood at the bottom of the stone staircase in a cream-colored coat that probably cost more than my old truck. One hand covered her nose against the smell of damp wood, mold, and air that had been trapped underground for decades. The other still held her phone, as though she intended to give the room only a few minutes before returning to meetings that mattered more. In front of her stood 12 rows of leaning wooden racks holding hundreds of dust-covered bottles. Their labels had yellowed with age. Some were so faded they could no longer be read. Rust coated the iron brackets, and years of salt air pushing through the foundation had caused sections of the wooden floor to swell and release the stale, earthy smell of a place long forgotten. Victoria looked around for less than 10 seconds before deciding that her father had left her a basement full of garbage. In his will, the room had been described in a single line: old wine room, no remaining practical value. Victoria understood those words in the simplest possible way. No practical value meant worthless. Worthless meant it needed to disappear. She had inherited Greyhaven Manor, a 42-room coastal estate surrounded by 12 acres of land and a private beach. The cellar was a minor detail inside an enormous inheritance she wanted settled as quickly as possible. She was preparing to sell the entire property to a luxury hotel group, and the photography team was due to arrive within days. I was there because I had been hired to inspect the estate's aging systems, dismantle anything no longer usable, and remove whatever the family did not want to keep. My name is Ethan Carter. I was 42 years old then, living with my 8-year-old daughter, Lily, in a rented house 6 miles inland from Greyhaven. Our kitchen window leaked whenever the rain came down hard. The furnace made a steady knocking sound every time it started. I knew how to repair both. What I did not have was enough money to repair them in the same month. That is the kind of arithmetic a single father eventually learns. Not every problem can be solved immediately. Sometimes all you can do is decide which problem is less dangerous and allow it to remain a problem for another 30 days. Lily's mother, Claire, had died 4 years earlier. It happened so quickly that for months afterward, I continued reaching for the coffee she used to drink. I would place it in my shopping cart before remembering there was no longer anyone at home waiting for it. Before Claire died, I worked as a senior maintenance technician at a coastal processing facility. I repaired conveyor systems, hydraulic lifts, refrigeration units, ventilation systems, and old machines that had been altered so many times no one could remember what their original designs looked like. Machines made sense to me in ways people sometimes did not. Machines did not hide what was wrong with them. A worn bearing screamed, a cracked pipe leaked, an overloaded motor overheated. People could stand directly in front of the most valuable thing in their lives and still refuse to see it. Machines could not. 18 months after Claire died, the facility where I worked shut down. The land was sold to a developer. Men and women who had spent 20 years keeping the place alive were told to pack their belongings into cardboard boxes and leave. After that, I took whatever honest work I could find. Roof repairs, boiler inspections, warehouse cleanouts, interior demolition, furniture moving. I only needed the work to be flexible enough for me to collect Lily from school most afternoons and make sure our refrigerator was never completely empty. The Greyhaven job came through a property management company. They needed someone who understood both demolition and old mechanical systems because the mansion contained aging pipes, a broken service lift, and a maintenance tunnel beneath the west wing. The pay was better than most temporary jobs. I accepted before they had finished describing it. Greyhaven Manor stood on a cliff outside Newport, Rhode Island. The estate had belonged to the Ashford family for 5 generations. Pale stone walls faced the Atlantic. Its dark slate roof, narrow chimneys, and tall windows made it look like a building designed to outlive everyone who ever called it home. Victoria's father, Charles Ashford, had lived there alone during the last 11 years of his life. He was the man who turned Ashford Development into one of the largest privately owned real estate companies on the East Coast. Hotels, office towers, waterfront communities, shopping centers. If a building contained enough glass and steel to make an ordinary person feel small, There was a good chance Charles Ashford had been involved. Victoria had taken control of the company long before she inherited Greyhaven. From what I later learned, she had spent most of her adult life proving that she could run the empire without her father. The two of them could sit in a boardroom, negotiate a billion-dollar acquisition, and never raise their voices, but they could not sit across from one another at dinner for 20 minutes without becoming strangers. Charles died at 78 after suffering a heart attack in his study. There was no warning, no final conversation, no goodbye. Victoria responded the way people who are accustomed to controlling everything often respond when faced with a loss they cannot control. She turned her father's death into a project. Documents were categorized, properties were appraised, apartments were sold, personal belongings were divided into 4 groups: keep, sell, donate, or discard. Greyhaven was scheduled to be transferred before the end of the financial quarter. Every room had a deadline. Every object needed a clear value. The wine cellar had been placed in the final category before Victoria ever stepped inside it. She did not pay me in cash for clearing the cellar. Instead, she told me I could keep whatever was inside. If the metal could be sold, I could sell it. If the wood could be reused, I could take it. If the old wine had turned into vinegar, I could pour it away. In her mind, it was the fastest way to turn a useless room into payment for a working man who needed the money. She gave me the cellar the way someone might hand over a pile of scrap. 3 weeks later, armed security would be stationed outside that same room. A wine historian from London would hold one of its dusty bottles with both hands, afraid he might drop a missing piece of history. An insurance representative would place the preliminary value of the collection somewhere between $18 and $30 million. But that morning, no one could see any of that. Neither could I. I began work on Monday. The first thing I did was photograph everything in the cellar. Not because I believed the wine was valuable. I had cleared enough old houses to know that most things people keep for decades only matter to the people who kept them. I photographed everything because it was a rule. Before dismantling anything, you document where it stood, how it was assembled, and what condition it was in before your hands touched it. That rule had protected me more times than I could remember. The cellar contained 12 long rows of racks made from dark oak and secured to the stone walls with iron brackets. At first glance, they all appeared to be collapsing from age and moisture. But when I placed a level against the first section, I noticed that the leaning was not natural. Every third section tilted at exactly the same angle, 3 degrees toward the eastern wall. I checked the next row, 3 degrees, then the third, exactly the same. Rotting wood does not measure angles. Water damage does not produce the same distortion across 12 separate racks. Someone had deliberately built them to look unstable. I began cleaning the dust from the iron supports. Small brass numbers had been fixed beside each section, almost completely hidden beneath the grime. I expected the sequence to read 1, 2, 3, 4. It did not. 3, 1, 4, 2. The same order appeared on every row. I wrote it in my notebook. Julian Mercer, the Ashford family's estate manager, watched me from the staircase. He had worked for the family for nearly 20 years, wore a suit even when entering a cellar full of dust, and spoke to hired workers in the tone of a man who considered courtesy useful only when it benefited him. Julian believed I was wasting time. To him, it was only old wood, empty bottles, and a room that needed to be cleared before the photographers arrived. I told him the racks had been arranged according to a pattern. He suggested that wealthy families often arranged useless objects in patterns because it made those objects appear more important. I did not argue. Machines do not need to be defended with words. They only need someone willing to keep looking. Next, I examined the floor. Most of it consisted of stone covered by narrow oak boards. The sections nearest the racks had become soft and dark from moisture, but beneath the 4th row, one rectangular section made a different sound when I tapped it with the handle of my screwdriver. Hollow, not rotten, hollow. I removed a damaged board and found a narrow iron rod running beneath the floor. It continued toward the east and disappeared beneath the bases of the racks. That was when I stopped thinking of them as shelves. They were connected to something. I spent the rest of the morning examining the bottles. Most of them had been placed with their labels facing outward. But each row contained 4 bottles turned toward the wall. They were heavier than the others. One had a damaged cork. When I opened it, there was no wine inside, only fine black sand. A thin brass ring had been fitted around the base and concealed beneath years of dust. It was not a bottle of wine. It was a counterweight. Someone had constructed a mechanical system inside the cellar and disguised its most important components as objects most people would never bother to inspect. That was when I remembered the exact wording in the will. Old wine room. No remaining practical value, not worthless, not empty, no remaining practical value. I had spent enough years repairing machines to know that people who understood design usually chose their words carefully. I contacted Victoria's office and explained that the wine racks were connected to a hidden mechanism beneath the floor. I did not yet know what the mechanism did, but removing the racks normally might destroy it. Victoria had little interest in theories. She only wanted to know whether the cellar would be cleared on schedule. I told her I needed more time. In the end, she gave me until Friday morning. After that, the room was still expected to be empty. I returned to the brass numbers, 3142. It took nearly an hour for me to understand that they did not indicate order. They indicated movement. The third rack moved forward, the first lowered, the fourth moved backward, the second rose. The racks had not been permanently fixed. They rested on hidden pins inside the brackets and could move several inches if their weight was distributed correctly. The sand-filled bottles were part of the balancing system. The problem was that several bottles were missing, and 2 racks had partially collapsed. If I moved them with the wrong amount of weight, the mechanism could jam or destroy itself. Beneath each shelf were shallow carvings, straight lines, circles, triangles. I assumed they were old technical symbols. I was wrong. At around 3 that afternoon, Lily's school called. A plumbing failure had forced them to cancel the after-school program. I could not find anyone to watch her on such short notice, so I drove to collect her and brought her back to Greyhaven. I did not like taking my daughter to job sites, but a single father does not always get to choose between a good solution and a bad one. Sometimes the only choice is an imperfect solution or no solution at all. Lily sat at a folding table near the staircase with her homework, headphones, and a peanut butter sandwich. After finishing her math, she wandered closer to where I was working. She studied the paper on which I had copied the carvings from beneath the shelves. After several minutes, she rotated the page and placed pencils across it. Only then did I recognize what an 8-year-old child had seen immediately. They were not symbols. They were diagrams viewed from above. The straight lines represented the racks. The circles marked the counterweight bottles. The triangles indicated the direction each section needed to move. I'd been reading them as a language. Lily had looked at them as a picture. Without realizing it, she saved me hours of work. By evening, I'd calculated the missing weights and replaced the absent bottles with temporary containers of equal mass. I followed the sequence. The third rack moved forward. The first lowered. The fourth moved back. The second rose. Nothing happened. I tried again. Still nothing. The iron rod beneath the floor was under tension, but some kind of locking point inside the eastern wall was holding the entire mechanism in place. The following morning, I examined every air vent and discovered a compass-shaped carving in the stone behind the final row. At its center was a circular recess the exact size of a bottle's base. Only one bottle in the entire cellar had a brass bottom. It stood on the highest shelf, buried beneath so much dust that I had overlooked it twice. Its label read, Ashford Coastal Reserve, Mutngin Tam Trum Chinmui Sao. It contained no wine, only sand. I pressed the brass bottom into the stone recess and turned it. Metal shifted behind the wall. A chain moved beneath the floor. The racks trembled. Dust fell from the ceiling. Then everything stopped. The mechanism was still alive, but a broken gear had locked it in place. I removed 3 floorboards and crawled into the narrow space beneath the racks. The gap was so tight my shoulders nearly touched both sides. The iron rod connected to a series of bronze gears set into a stone trench. Most were rusted, but structurally intact. One gear had split through the center. Someone had attempted to repair it decades earlier by driving 2 steel pins through the crack. Over time, the pins had bent, locking the entire system. I removed the gear and carried it to the old workshop behind the carriage house. The original piece had 48 teeth and had been cut by hand from bronze. I could not reproduce it perfectly in a single day. I didn't need perfection. I only needed it to survive one complete cycle. Victoria returned to Greyhaven on Wednesday evening. When she entered the cellar, she saw an open floor, tools scattered across the stone, temporary counterweights replacing several bottles, and the brass bottom bottle fitted into the wall. I could see the irritation on her face. In her eyes, I had transformed a simple cleanup job into an excavation with no clear end. Julian believed the entire project had become a legal liability and wanted it stopped immediately. I explained that I had found the release mechanism but still did not know what it would open. Victoria looked around the cellar as though trying to decide whether her curiosity was worth the inconvenience. In the end, she gave me until noon the following day. If the mechanism still did nothing by then, the entire room would be removed. I worked until close to midnight. At 6 the next morning, the replacement gear was fitted into place. At 9, Lily's school called again. The plumbing problem had not been resolved. I had to bring her with me once more. At 10:30, Victoria arrived with Julian, the family attorney, and 2 property representatives. I checked every counterweight, inserted the brass bottle into the lock, adjusted each rack. Then I began the sequence. This time, the system responded. The 3rd rack slid forward. The 1st lowered. The 4th moved backward. The 2nd rose. Chains tightened beneath the floor. All 12 racks began moving in alternating directions, no longer resembling furniture but the tumblers inside an enormous lock. Stone scraped against stone behind the eastern wall. A narrow line appeared between 2 massive slabs. Cold air moved through the opening. The wall slowly drew inward and slid aside. Behind it was a darkness deeper than anything I had expected. Not a cabinet, not a small storage room, a stone corridor descending into the cliff. I tested the air before entering. The oxygen level was safe. There were no dangerous gases, but the temperature made me stop. The outer cellar was nearly 68 degrees Fahrenheit. The hidden space remained close to 54. It had maintained a stable storage temperature without electricity, compressors, or any modern refrigeration equipment. The corridor opened into a circular chamber built directly into the coastal rock. Copper pipes ran through channels in the ceiling. A shallow stream of cold water flowed beneath a grated section of the floor. Sea-facing vents connected to vertical shafts hidden inside the mansion walls. It took me several minutes to understand the design. Cold air entered through openings beneath the cliff. Warm air escaped through the vertical shafts. The underground water stabilized both temperature and humidity. Changes in tidal pressure automatically adjusted a series of brass valves. The room needed no electricity because the cliff itself was part of the machine. It was not merely a wine cellar, it was a passive climate control system engineered into the coastline hundreds of years earlier. 14 oak cabinets stood inside the chamber, sealed with wax and brass. A long drafting table occupied the center. Rolled plans, notebooks, and records had been preserved beneath glass. The first cabinet carried the Ashford crest and the date Motngin Tam Trum Haimwimot. When I opened it, I found 36 bottles resting in individually carved compartments. There was no dust, no moisture. The corks were sealed beneath dark wax. Each label was protected by a thin sheet of mica. The remaining cabinets contained Madeira, port, Burgundy, and Champagne from the late 18th and early 19th centuries. Some of the producers named on the labels had disappeared from history. The final cabinets did not contain wine. They held shipping records, purchase letters, maps, chemical notes, and detailed mechanical drawings of the preservation system. Each generation of the Ashford family had quietly maintained the room. There was no public record of it, nothing in the modern property documents. It appeared the chamber had never been intended for display. It had been designed simply to survive. Lily was the one who noticed the envelope bearing Victoria's name, placed behind a leather notebook. Victoria lifted it, but did not open it in front of us. For the first time since I had met her, I saw her hands shake. Inside that room, Victoria no longer looked like a billionaire capable of buying and selling an entire city block before lunch. She looked like a daughter who had just discovered that her father possessed a hidden world he had never shared with her. By the end of that day, Greyhaven was no longer an estate preparing to be sold. Security barriers surrounded the West Wing. The photography session was canceled. Environmental preservation specialists were called in. Everyone who had entered the chamber signed a confidentiality agreement. I was asked to remain because no one understood the opening mechanism or climate system better than I did. For the first time in years, people needed me for what I knew rather than what I could carry. 2 experts arrived the following morning. The first was Dr. Samuel Laurent, a wine historian who had advised museums, auction houses, and major private collectors. He entered the hidden room with the caution of a man unwilling to be fooled by a wealthy family's story about treasure beneath an old mansion. Then he saw the bottle of Chateau Bellecour from Mat Ngin Bay Trum Chin Mui Mot. His composure disappeared. He held it with both hands. The producer was believed to have been destroyed during the political upheaval of the late 18th century. Most surviving records suggested its final vintage had been completely lost. But the wax seal appeared original, the glass composition matched the period, the label had survived almost intact. After examining the remaining cabinets, he did not describe them as a wine collection. He called them a missing chapter of European wine history. The second expert was Dr. Naomi Bell, a mechanical engineer specializing in historic environmental systems. She spent nearly a full day examining the copper pipes, water channel, air vents, pressure valves, and technical drawings. What astonished her was not the age of the system. It was how well it continued to function. Modern facilities use sensors, compressors, cooling systems, and electronic controls to create conditions that this chamber had maintained through natural mechanics for more than 2 centuries. The outer wine racks were not merely a lock, they were part of the calibration system. Moving them changed the airflow through channels inside the stone. The sand-filled bottles kept the mechanism balanced. If someone emptied the racks without understanding their purpose, the system would lock itself. Victoria had nearly done exactly that. The drawings also described 3 improved versions of the design. One could be installed beneath buildings without direct access to a coastal cliff. With modern materials, the system could significantly reduce the energy required for luxury wine storage. Authentication took 9 days. The paper was dated. The handwriting was examined. The glass composition was analyzed. The seals were compared against historic shipping records. No expert wanted to provide a single fixed price because rare objects do not truly have one. Their value is whatever 2 wealthy and determined people are willing to fight over. The preliminary insurance estimate for the collection ranged from $18 to $30 million. The mechanical designs might eventually be worth even more if adapted commercially. The mansion Victoria had been preparing to sell for $12 million was now standing above a chamber worth several times that amount. From that moment on, everyone at Greyhaven began behaving differently. The cellar, once described as garbage, now had round-the-clock security. The bottles Victoria had allowed me to empty were handled with specialized gloves. Julian, who had ordered me to stop wasting time, began introducing me as the technical specialist who had uncovered the chamber. People often change the words they use for you after someone else confirms your value. It does not necessarily mean they have changed the way they see you. About 10 days after the room was opened, Victoria found me repairing one of the original rack guides. She had read the letter her father left behind. Charles had known his daughter would sell Greyhaven. He knew she would read the phrase "no remaining practical value" and immediately interpret it as worthless. In the letter, he wrote that Victoria had spent too many years removing anything she could not measure immediately. He also wrote that the room could only be opened by someone patient enough to repair what everyone else wanted removed. I believe Charles had expected his daughter to hire someone skilled. Victoria understood it differently. She believed her father knew she would dismiss that person. The realization settled heavily over the cellar, because she had not only dismissed the room, she had dismissed the man standing inside it. 2 days later, Victoria returned with the board of the family foundation, insurance representatives, and a museum conservation team. By then, every bottle had been cataloged. Not one had been removed. The historic climate system continued operating exactly as it had before Charles Ashford's death. Victoria stood in front of me and looked again at everything she had once been willing to discard. She remembered that she had paid me for my work by giving me the cellar. She remembered granting me permission to sell the metal, pour away the wine, and dismantle the racks. She also understood that if I had followed her instructions exactly, both the collection and the machine might have been destroyed before anyone knew they existed. She wanted to know why I had not stolen several bottles, why I had not demanded millions, and why I was only asking for the payment originally agreed upon. I told her what I had already thought many times. I had not found a treasure. I had only repaired something she had called garbage. The treasure had been there for generations. Her family had protected it. Her father had preserved the mechanism. The craftsman who built it 200 years before I was born had done the difficult part. I was simply the person who noticed that something broken was not necessarily useless. Victoria did not answer immediately. She was a woman accustomed to having the final word in every meeting. But that was the first time I saw her remain silent without using silence to control the room. There are moments when money can solve almost any problem, and there are moments when money has to stand still and listen. Victoria offered to pay me more. I refused. My work had value, but that value did not change simply because the room contained more money than either of us expected. Then she mentioned Lily and my financial situation. I did not like that. My daughter was not a reason for a wealthy person to overpay me. I did not want pity disguised as a reward. Victoria understood, so she made a different offer, not a bonus, not charity, a job. The conservation team needed someone who understood the original mechanism. Dr. Bell wanted a permanent technical director for the restoration project. The system needed to be documented, repaired, and reproduced. Greyhaven would become a research center and museum. The position offered a stable salary, health insurance, and working hours that allowed me to take Lily to school and pick her up afterward. I accepted on the condition that the historic mechanism would not be replaced merely because modern equipment looked cleaner. I also insisted that the names of the people who built and maintained the system be included in the museum, not only the Ashford family. Carpenters, stoneworkers, metalworkers, cellar keepers, engineers, every person whose hands had protected the treasure but whose life had never appeared in the official history. Victoria agreed. That was how I became technical director of the Greyhaven Preservation Project. Not because a billionaire rescued me, because I had spent my life learning how to listen when old machines tried to explain what had happened to them. There is a difference. The collection was eventually insured for $27,400,000. Not a single bottle was sold. Victoria placed the entire collection into a protected trust managed by the Ashford Foundation. The hidden chamber became the centerpiece of a museum dedicated to low-energy architecture, historic mechanics, and the preservation of wine. Dr. Bell's team reproduced part of the climate system using modern materials. During the first tests, the adapted design reduced energy consumption in luxury storage facilities by more than half. Licensing revenue funded the research center. Greyhaven was never converted into a hotel. Victoria kept the house, although during the first year she rarely slept there. Some buildings are easier to inherit than the memories inside them. Lily and I moved into a small house closer to her school. The kitchen window no longer leaked. The furnace made no knocking sound. Lily said she missed the sound of the old one. I told her that if she ever felt nostalgic, she was welcome to kick the pipes. She did not find that funny. After school, Lily often visited Greyhaven. Dr. Bell taught her about pressure valves. Dr. Laurent taught her how to read old wine labels. Victoria taught her how to win an argument without raising her voice. I spent a great deal of time attempting to undo that final lesson. Victoria changed slowly. Real change usually happens that way. People do not become someone different simply because a wall opens and reveals $30 million. They change when they are forced to look back at the moment before the wall opened and admit what they had been prepared to destroy. Victoria began attending the preservation meetings herself. She read the names of the workers listed in the historic records. She ordered that their names be displayed beside the Ashfords, not beneath them. Nearly a year later, I found her standing alone in the outer cellar where everything had begun. She was holding the document containing the words, "No remaining practical value." Victoria believed it had been her father's final test. She admitted she had failed it. In her mind, I was the one who had passed, but my name had never appeared in the will. Perhaps that had been the point. Charles had spent his life protecting value from people who only wanted to sell it. But Victoria eventually realized that her father had been wrong about one thing. He believed the right person would recognize value immediately. She understood that some people had to be taught how to see. We stood inside that cellar listening to the old mechanism adjust itself with the tide. No computers, no electric motor, only water, air, pressure, and the quiet movement of a brass wheel beneath the floor. The system had survived for generations because the people who created it understood something the modern world often forgets. New does not always mean better, expensive does not always mean valuable, and broken does not mean finished. I had spent most of my life repairing things: machines, windows, furnaces, the loose wheel on Lily's bicycle, the kitchen chair Claire always meant to replace but never did. Greyhaven taught me that the hardest things to repair are not made from wood or metal. They are the ways people have learned to judge one another. Victoria saw a dusty cellar and called it garbage. Julian saw a maintenance worker and decided he could easily be replaced. I saw a broken gear. None of us could see the whole truth from where we stood. The only difference was that I was willing to kneel down and look more closely. Sometimes a great discovery does not begin with genius. It does not begin with luck. It does not begin with destiny. It begins when one person decides to spend one more honest minute examining something everyone else has already dismissed. The room had never been worthless, the bottles had never been garbage, and I had never been only a cleanup worker. They merely appeared worthless to people who had decided their value before taking the time to look. The most valuable things in this world rarely arrive beneath polished labels and perfect lighting. Sometimes they remain hidden inside dark rooms. Sometimes they wait beneath centuries of dust. Sometimes they appear in old work boots and a faded jacket with a name stitched above the pocket. And sometimes the only person capable of opening the door is the person everyone else almost sent away.